So good evening everyone, welcome to Bajirao Ias Academy, UPSC Mains 2025 question paper analysis. And in fact today we have a set of questions from General Studies paper 1. Those questions include Indian history, art and culture, Indian geography and also Indian society. So one by one, let's try and discuss these questions in a very detailed manner. And as I've already told you that the objective of this discussion is to make sure that you will be adequately equipped with the structuring, presentation and how to introduce, how to conclude the answer and what are the components a best answer should consist of. So therefore we are going to discuss all the essential features of a best answer through this discussion. So another very important topic, a question that has been asked this year UPSC mains examination. So examine the main aspects of Akbar's religious syncretism. And in fact Mughals in medieval Indian history, a very important chapter for both prelims and mains exams, right? So we all knew about that. Now in this context, so we should also read Mughals culture and the religious policies, the political system, Mughals art, architecture and also the other important elements of the Mughal rule. So therefore by this we get to know that the UPSC may ask Mughals religious policies, the political system, their economic system, their art and architecture, right? So it actually provides us important insights about the UPSC asking questions from the Indian history. So earlier it was expected that so UPSC mostly ask questions from the art and architecture. So therefore if we talk about the model framework, now in this particular question the introduction should be the Akbar's emphasis on Sul-Hai-Kul, right? So first of all we should talk about Sul-Hai-Kul of Akbar, because Akbar over a period of time he evolved, right? So his religious policy or his attitude towards religion has changed over a period of time. Now if we talk about the body, so in the body part of the answer what should we actually mention? In fact the policy included abolition of jizya and Ibadat Khana debates which used to take place in Akbar's court, and creation of Din-i-Ilahi, so a separate religion, so that was established by Akbar, and Rajput alliances and cultural translations, right? So therefore overall this is the essential part of the body. We have to write all these important aspects if we talk about the religious syncretism during Akbar. Now in conclusion, so you just have to mention that though Din-i-Ilahi faded, Sul-Hai-Kul shaped Mughal pluralism, inspiring India's secular ethos. Now in fact among the Mughals, Akbar adopted a secular approach, right, with respect to religion. So he adopted a secular approach. So therefore let's understand, so this is the model framework of this particular question. So let's understand this in a detailed way. Now we all knew that Mughal ruler Akbar, so he was the third ruler or emperor of the Mughal empire, and Akbar ruled from 1556 to 1605, and Akbar is associated with the second battle of Panipat, right? So Akbar is associated with the second battle of Panipat and he ruled from 1556 to 1605. And in fact Akbar is famous for his religious policy, because his religious policy had a secular outlook. So since his religious policy had a secular outlook, so therefore this is unique and it should be remembered. because this religious policy of Akbar, it has not only emphasized on the secular characters or the secular aspects, rather it also emphasized on the features like tolerance and also syncretism, right? So it has also emphasized on these essential features as well, right? So earlier Mughals and Delhi Sultanate period, the Islamic rulers followed the orthodox Islam, but we can say that Akbar and his religious policy is a heterodox Islam, or his attitude towards the religion is the secular attitude. Now secular attitude essentially means that, you know, he respect all the religions equally, right? So in fact Akbar promoted a sul-i-kul, so which means peace with all, and in fact he sought to unify the diverse faiths as well, because at that point of time Buddhists, Sikhs, Jains, so therefore a number of different religious people were existing. So therefore he sought to unify the different faiths, and that is the essence of Akbar's secular outlook, right? So that is the essential feature of his secular outlook, because he sought to unify diverse faiths under the Mughal Empire. And in fact his measures actually reflected both political pragmatism for stability of multi-religious empire and also the personal philosophical quest for the truth, right? So therefore this is how you have to briefly introduce about the religious policy of Akbar. So this can actually create a good impression about the answer. Now let's understand the main aspects of Akbar's religious syncretism, and this is the key theme of the question, so this has to be understood properly. So firstly, so he followed a policy of toleration. So this policy of toleration is also called as sul-i-kul, right? So this is the policy of toleration. Now what Akbar tried to do? Akbar essentially tried to unify diverse faiths. So in order to unify diverse faiths, toleration as a value is very important. So therefore he abolished jizya tax. So he abolished jizya tax in 1564, and he even abolished the pilgrimage. He even abolished the pilgrimage tax as well, right? So you know, pilgrimage tax is a jizya tax, right? You know, if you go for the pilgrimage and if you're not a Muslim, you have to pay the jizya tax, and if you are a non-Muslim and if you are going for the pilgrimage, you have to pay the taxes. So Akbar viewed this as discriminatory. So therefore what he had done, so he abolished both jizya tax and the pilgrimage tax as well for the non-Muslims. So this essentially reflects his policy of tolerance, which actually reflects his policy of sul-i-kul, peace with all. And in fact he even promoted the equal treatment of all subjects, right? Equal treatment of all subjects. So he started looking at all subjects equally with equal lens. For example, in Akbar's court, so he appointed Raja Todarmal as the finance minister, right? So he was a Hindu and he was appointed as a finance minister. So that essentially reflects Akbar's policy, Akbar's secular outlook and equal treatment of all his subjects. And another example is Raja Man Singh was a military commander in top offices during Akbar. Now let's understand the religious debates and the Ibadat Khana that was existing. And in fact he established Ibadat Khana 1575 at Fatehpur Sikri. Now Fatehpur Sikri is also a place, a town that a Mughal emperor Akbar established or founded, right? So he established this Ibadat Khana for interfaith dialogue. And what used to take place at Ibadat Khana? Regular debates, dialogues, discussions. So these things used to take place regularly at Ibadat Khana, and he established this Ibadat Khana at Fatehpur Sikri for interfaith dialogues. And he even invited Muslim ulemas, Hindu pandits, Jain monks, Zoroastrian priests, and Jesuit missionaries as well. And if we talk about this Jesuit missionaries, so the Jesuit missionaries introduced him to the Christian theology, and Jain influence led to the restrictions of the animal slaughter as well. So because of Jain influence on Akbar, so he prohibited the animal slaughter, and the Christian theology was introduced by the Jesuit missionaries to him, right? So he invited the different important experts from different faiths, for example Muslim ulemas, Hindu pandits, Jain monks, Zoroastrian priests. So everyone were invited to this Ibadat Khana for the regular debates and discussions. Now if we talk about this Din-i-Ilahi, right, so this was a different faith that was established by Akbar, right? So he launched it as a syncretic faith blending elements of Islam. So Islam preaches oneness of God, Hinduism which talks about the karma and bhakti, Jainism which talks about the ahimsa, Christianity and Zoroastrianism or sun fire worship. So therefore he talks about all essential things or all essential features. And even he stressed on ethical conduct, loyalty, devotion to the emperor rather than the ritual practices. So he not just emphasized on the ritual practices, rather he emphasized on the ethical conduct, loyalty, devotion to the emperor. So ultimately he brought in important elements of all different religions together through Din-i-Ilahi. So therefore he emphasized on ethical conduct, loyalty and devotion to the emperor rather than focusing on the ritual practices. And in fact Birbal, who is one of his courtier, was among the few followers of the religion that was established by Akbar. And in fact this separate religion established or founded by Akbar had a very minor or limited acceptance. So therefore it actually symbolizes Akbar's universalist vision about the religion and his secular outlook or attitude. Now if we talk about the socio-cultural integration, now Rajput alliances through the matrimonial ties, for example marriage to Hakkabai, mother of Jahangir, so it has ensured a Hindu-Muslim cooperation, right? So what it has done, it has ensured Hindu-Muslim cooperation, right? So apart from that, so at that point of time this type of a harmony is very important. So the Hindu-Muslim unity or Hindu-Muslim cooperation is very important. And he even patronized translation of Sanskrit texts, example Mahabharata, into Rajnama, right? So he patronized the translation of Sanskrit texts such as Mahabharata into Rajmanama, and he even encouraged the composite Mughal culture in art, architecture and the literature as well. Now if we talk about the conclusion, right, so if we specifically talk about the conclusion, so Akbar's religious syncretism, so it went beyond mere tolerance, right? So it was not just about the tolerance, rather it attempted to create a shared ethical foundation for the plural society as well. And in fact this Din-i-Ilahi, so it started fading after his death, because this Din-i-Ilahi as a separate faith established by Akbar, and after the death of Akbar, so this separate religion established by Akbar started fading. And in fact his principle of sulh-i-kul or the principle of toleration, It has influenced the Mughal governance, and it even echoes India's secular and pluralist framework. Now, even Indian constitution is a secular constitution, right? So we value unity in diversity, right? So therefore, the pluralistic framework, the secular outlook of the Indian constitution, Indian governance, is also influenced by the Mughal, particularly Akbar's religious policies. And in fact, it is being said that Akbar's religious views are still relevant today. Why? Because there are communal violence incidents, communal riots which have been taking place very frequently. So therefore, it actually offers lessons in inclusive governance and cultural accommodation in diverse societies. Right? So this is how you just have to write the conclusion for this particular answer. Now, the next question is, the sculptors filled the Chandela art form with resilient vigor and breadth of life. Elucidate. Right? So, in fact, the Chandela art form is a very important aspect, because Chandelas were one of the rulers who ruled the medieval India. Right? So the sculptors filled with Chandela art form with resilient vigor and breadth of life. Right? So therefore, this is a very important aspect if we talk about the introduction. Now, firstly, we need to talk about the context. Right? The context is that, the Chandela art form. Now, when we emphasize on Chandela art form, particularly we need to talk about the sculptors, the sculpture which is present on the Khajuraho temples, and the identity and its significance. Right? So in fact, the Chandela's period should also be mentioned in the introduction. So they ruled from 9th century CE to 13th century CE. Right? So you just have to break it into the thematic headings in the body part of the answer, and you have to explain the sculptural marvel of Chandelas. And in conclusion, you just have to link the continuity and the contemporary relevance of the sculpture of Chandelas. And remember, you should also mention examples as well along with the answer. So if we talk about the introduction of Chandelas, now Chandelas actually ruled this place from 9th century to 13th century CE. Right? So in fact, the Chandelas actually belong to the Rajput dynasty. They belong to the Rajput dynasty, and they ruled from 9th century to 13th century. And in fact, the Chandelas have ruled the Bundelkhand region. They have ruled the Bundelkhand region, and this Bundelkhand region had a capital at that point of time. The capital was Khajuraho. Right? So Khajuraho Jain temples are known for their sculpture, their rich, elaborate sculpture. Right? So Chandelas were Rajput rulers, and they ruled Bundelkhand region from 9th century to 13th century with the capital Khajuraho. Now in Khajuraho there are Jain temples, and they have rich and elaborate sculpture, and that sculpture is very famous. And in fact, the Chandelas were the prolific patrons of art and architecture. Especially, they patronized the temples, and in fact, they even recognized as UNESCO World Heritage Sites. UNESCO World Heritage Sites. And in fact, the Chandela art form, particularly the Khajuraho temple sculptures, so they actually represents the fusion of spirituality, and sensuality. So ultimately embodying not only the religious devotion but also the full vitality of human existence. So there's no need to write everything in the introduction, but you have to understand about the Chandelas and their importance or their temples at Khajuraho, and how those temples represent a fusion of spirituality and sensuality, embodying not only religious devotion but also the vitality of the human existence. And in the body part of the answer, so you just have to understand that they represent a resilient vigor in sculptural expression, because these sculptures actually depict gods, goddesses, warriors, dancers, and even the celestial beings in fluid, energetic postures. Now, if you just look at the Khajuraho temples, so you can see everything in those temple walls as a sculpture. So you can identify, you can find gods, goddesses, warriors, dancers, everything. For example, the sculptures of Apsarasas and Surasundaris in lively Tribhanga poses, so they are actually well represented on the walls of the Khajuraho temples. And in fact, the erotic imagery, because the Mithuna sculptures, which are also known as the erotic images on the walls of the Khajuraho temples, they celebrated Kama, or existence of human life. And in fact, they portrayed Kama as a legitimate pursuit or Purushartha. Right? So it is one of the important Purushartha, right? A legitimate pursuit. So therefore, it shows the vitality or importance of human existence and human relationships. So let's understand the narrative reliefs. So we should also talk about the narrative reliefs as well, because it actually represents scenes from daily life, battles, hunting, festivals. So it shows resilience, because it is not easy to represent all these different characteristics, all these different features in sculptural form. So therefore, you can understand how the sculptors during the Chandela period have shown everything on the temple walls, right? So that's what we can say, that their resilient vigor in sculptural expression. And in fact, the artistic techniques further enhances the vitality as well. For example, high relief carving gives much more depth and dynamism. And in fact, they have used proportionality and graceful curves, which actually conveys the movement. And there's also a narrative sequencing on temple walls, and that creates a sense of continuity and rhythm as well. And in fact, in these sculptures, breadth of life has also been captured, because it shows the religious diversity that was existing, because it was blend of Shiva, Shaivism, Vaishnavism, and even the Jain Tirthankaras. So therefore, it actually reflects an inclusivity of different faiths, right? So it actually represents the inclusivity of different faiths, secular themes, because there are sculptures of musicians, dancers, artists. So everything has been represented here, right? So therefore, it shows the cultural vibrancy that existed at that point of time. And even they have shown the nature and animals as well. For example, elephants, horses, lions, mythical beings. Now, if you look at the images, you can see everything on the walls of these temples, and integration of the spiritual and the mundane life, because the erotic secular motifs, they coexist with divine imaginary, so imagery suggesting life in its overall or complete totality, right? And in conclusion, the Chandela sculptors have transformed the stone into living narrative of human spirit, society, and the divinity. And even the Khajuraho temples remain a testament to India's the aesthetic richness, and symbolizing the balance of dharma, artha, kama, and moksha, a vision still relevant to understand Indian art and cultural philosophy today. And that's how you need to conclude this particular answer. But make sure that you have to mention all essential features of the Chandela's sculptures which are present on the walls of the Khajuraho Jain temples, along with examples. So next important question is, how are climate change and sea level rise are affecting the very existence of many island nations? Now we all knew that because of the anthropogenic factors, what has been happening? Anthropogenic factors are responsible for the emission of the greenhouse gases, and greenhouse gases would further contribute to the global warming, and global warming would result in the climate change, right? So this leads to climate change. So greenhouse gases, global warming, and climate change. Now climate change or global warming, I would say, leads to the melting of ice caps or glaciers. Melting of ice caps and the glaciers, right? So therefore melting of ice caps and glaciers ultimately contribute to the rising sea levels. Now rising sea levels would emerge as a threat to the island nations, right? So you just have to briefly introduce about the climate change and sea level rise, and if you have any data on this, just present the data about that. For example, IPCC mentions about that, so you just mention such data, and then you just have to mention examples along with the analysis in the thematic impacts. And you should also write the conclusion as well. For example, you can mention suggestions or a way forward as well. Now in the introduction, what you have to write? Now climate change is driven by global warming, and it is a leading thermal expansion of oceans and accelerated melting of glaciers. So as I've already told you that the global warming is responsible for melting ice caps and glaciers, and melting glaciers leads to increasing the oceans, or the thermal expansion of oceans and accelerated melting of the glaciers. So as I have already told you that you could mention IPCC data report. Now the global sea level is projected to rise between 0.26 to 0.77 meters by 2100 as per the IPCC report 2021. And small island developing states, for example, small island developing states, Micronesia, Polynesia, so those countries, Tuvalu, Tonga, so they are known as the small island developing states in the Pacific Ocean, Indian Ocean and Caribbean Oceans. So they have been facing the existential threat, because when the sea levels rise, obviously these small island nations would submerge because of increasing sea levels, right? So in fact they face threat from the submergence of land, to economic collapse and forced migration, and the problem of climate refugee as well, right? So let's understand about the body part of the answer. So loss of territory and submergence of the land, because what has been happening is that rising seas are eroding the coastlines and threatening the submergence of the entire islands. So it is a well-known fact that if the sea levels are rising, so it erodes the coastlines and it would also threaten the submergence of entire islands. And the example is Maldives, right? So Maldives with 80% land and just 1 meter above the sea level, so it may become uninhabitable by the year 2100. Within a century it may become uninhabitable because of the submergence of the coastlines, rise in the sea levels. Now Kiribati has already purchased land in Fiji as a potential refuge for its population, because it has been experiencing the rising sea surface levels and the submergence problems as well, and because of this reason it has already purchased land at Fiji. And in fact, there are some threats, such as threats to the existing freshwater resources as well, because there is a possibility of freshwater, so saltwater intrusion in case of sea level rise, and it would contaminate the existing aquifers, reduces access to the drinking water. So we may not have adequate amount of drinking water. For example, Tuvalu faces the periodic droughts worsened by the salt water, so therefore it forcing reliance on expensive desalination plants, right? So you just have to mention such examples along with the answer. And similarly, Marshall Islands, right? So the Marshall Islands, so they are reporting the rising cases of waterborne diseases linked to the degraded water quality. Now, impact on livelihoods and food security. For example, fisheries and coral reefs are disrupted by rising seas and warming oceans, thereby reducing the existing fish stocks. For example, Solomon Islands have lost the arable land due to the coastal erosion, therefore it damages the subsistence agriculture. Now, what exactly is a subsistence agriculture? Now, agriculture which is practiced only for the consumption, which is called as subsistence agriculture. And coral bleaching in the Great Barrier Reef near the Australian coast. So it threatens the tourism dependent economies of the Pacific Island nations, and sea level rise, increasing sea surface temperatures would result in the coral bleaching and increased frequency of extreme weather events. So rising seas amplify the storm surges, cyclones and flooding as well. For example, Cyclone Palm 2015. Cyclone Farm has devastated Vanuatu, and that has displaced thousands of people. And in fact, Fiji also faces repeated cyclones, for example Cyclone Winston, with damages equal to 20% of its GDP. So therefore, because of the climate change and global warming, such such weather phenomenon are very common, and they are creating a huge havoc. It has been, these phenomenons are also leading to the displacement of the people. So in fact, they also pose the cultural and national identity risk, because they would lose the ancestral land, heritage sites, undermine the cultural identity. For example, the traditional burial grounds at Kiribati and Tuvalu, so they are being washed away. Some nations like Maldives are becoming nations without the territory, raising questions under the international law. And the climate refugee problem, or climate induced migration, and even the security concerns. So there are some concerns as well in this matter. So displacement leads to the climate refugees, creating the regional instability. For example, Kiribati's migration with dignity policy, and that prepares citizens for the relocation as well. And in fact, UN Security Council debates classify such crises as security threats. Now, if we talk about the conclusion in this answer, so what should be the conclusion? Now, climate change and sea level rise are not just the environmental challenges, but they are the existential threats that the human civilization has been facing. And many island nations would submerge under the water if we don't control the global warming and climate change. So under the Paris Agreement, we plan to limit the global temperatures below 2 degrees Celsius, if possible, to 1.5 degrees Celsius. So therefore, they endanger our territory, livelihoods, culture and sovereignty. So therefore, this underscores the urgency of the global climate action, especially through frameworks like Paris Agreement, and need for the climate justice and the adaptation finance for vulnerable small island developing states. Right? So this is how you just have to conclude this answer. Now that's all in this lecture, and thank you so much.